Hernandez. Welcome to This is Horror Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm a longtime listener, so this is really an honor to be on with both of you.
Well, we are so glad that you have joined us today. And as you might anticipate, to begin with, I want to talk about your early life. And specifically, I want to know what some of the early life lessons were that you learned growing up.
Is this going to pertain to writing or just in general?
It can pertain to anything you would like it to. So, I mean, how about a writing lesson and general life lessons?
I'm a military brat, so I kind of grew up all over the world. I was actually born in Japan. I'm not sure how far it is distant from you, but I was born in Okinawa. I
Oh,
have
yeah. Yeah.
almost no memories of it. I believe there was a typhoon at one point, and I have a very vague memory of the windows shaking, and that's about it. After that, we moved to Texas, and I kind of bounced around here. I'd consider it my home. And then from there, England. I guess you and I kind of sync up in a few ways. I was stationed in England as a dependent for a while before I joined the Air Force myself, and since then I've lived kind of all over the United States and Guam as well. And I'm currently back in Texas. So, as far as a lesson in that, get to the airport early.
That's
That's
a good lesson to
yeah.
have.
I'm a
Yeah.
people watcher, so I enjoy getting to the airport early, getting my airport beer, and just watching people go.
Yeah, yeah. So if you don't have many memories of living in Okinawa, was that like the first 2, 3, 4
Mhm.
years of your life?
I believe I was in the womb on the way over there, and so we would have left right probably before I turned 3. So I mean, I have pictures that show me there. We had a live-in nanny for a bit, just because my parents are both military, named Nabuka, and I have lots of pictures of us together. She fed me a lot of rice. I was a very heavy baby, and yeah, I know I was there. Just don't really have any memory other than that kind of vague recollection of the windows shaking.
Yeah, yeah, it is a very typhoon prone area. I mean, of
Mhm.
course, Japan in general is pretty prone to both typhoons and earthquakes, but
Mhm.
yeah, in particular, Okinawa does suffer from that. But to move towards England, because you mentioned that as well, I'm wondering where specifically you were in England, and perhaps being older, you have more memories of that time.
I definitely do. I think the town, like the nearest town that English people kind of know when I would mention it is Cambridge. But we were stationed at RAF Lakenheath. I believe that's in. I don't remember that is Sussex or Essex. I forget. It's one of the two. So I moved there when I was 16. Left when I was kind of late 18, close to 19. So I learned how to drive there, and got to tour the mainland quite a bit. Um, have a lot of memories of England and it being gray a lot. Um, Overall, really enjoyed our time there, and can't wait to get back at some point when it's in the cards for us.
Yeah, well, being grey most of the time is certainly par for the course in England, particularly the further up north you go, I have noticed. But in terms of learning to drive there, I mean, great skill to have, but then when you came back to America, you probably had to relearn a number of things just on the basis of you then driving on the right rather than the left side of the road.
So we had an American car in England, and so that was a fun experience. And it took up like the whole road. Like for here, a Nissan Maxima is like it's a decent sized sedan, but Bob and I both live in Texas, so we've got pickup trucks that are like tanks. So a Nissan Maxima for us is towards the smaller end, but in England it felt like I was in a tank, like it was bigger than any car around me. And I would say the one advantage I had coming back was understanding how roundabouts work, because in the States people you can see it when it's their first time, like coming up to a roundabout, and there's just some sense of panic, or like the Mr. Bean skit where they're just kind of going in circles, not sure kind of when to get off. Um, but I was a very well seasoned roundabout driver by the time I got back to the States.
See, and the thing you're saying about the size of the roads and the different cars, this is why a number of my colleagues, if they're from America, they kind of freak out about driving on Japanese roads because Japanese roads and the typical Japanese car, I mean, there's a whole class of K cars, light vehicles, they're even smaller. So, for me, going from the UK to Japan, it's like, okay, the roads or some of the roads in the rural areas, they are smaller, but it doesn't feel so drastic. But yeah, if you go America to Japan, it's like, well, you've cut out the middleman of the UK. And I mean, it's kind of funny because you've got this K car class of light vehicles, me driving around in my not very big at all for Western standards Mazda 2 is like a giant compared to 50% of the vehicles. I feel powerful.
Yeah, our my sister had a Mini for her first car, so there was a nice just juxtaposition there, feeling like I was in a go kart, and then getting in the Maxima, which felt like I was, like in an SUV, pretty much.
Yeah, yeah. But as this is horror and not the this is automobile podcast, we are going to jump to those early life lessons, those formative experiences with story. And I believe that some of the books that you were reading from an early age were Goosebumps and Fear Street. So let's talk a little bit about that.
So I'm definitely a Scholastic book fair boy. I was one of the two or three kids that kind of kept that thing going in school. I remember we'd get the flyer, and sometimes it was me and one other person that would come back with our orders. Um, I very much remember the smell of a brand new Goosebumps book. Like, it's probably chemical and not good for you, but I remember like just inhaling that, and the texture, because it used to have those little bumps in the Goosebumps, and then kind of dipped a little bit into Fear Street. There were some like girls on the cover when I was starting to have some curiosity there, but at the same time I was reading Stephen King. So I don't know how I balanced that, because I was reading Carrie, and then I would go read Why I'm Afraid of Bees. Um, and still kind of get the same enjoyment level out of both of them. One of them definitely felt a little more taboo, and I would read that one, with the little night light in bed with the blankets over me, versus the one I could read at the dinner table, which was appropriate for my age. But try like reading now as a father, Goosebumps to my son. I don't understand why I was so entertained by it, other than the age. But even he feels a little bit like we can move on from this. Like, we're ready for the next thing. He's 8, but he's shown an interest in horror since probably 3 or 4. So I remember watching Killer Clowns was a big moment for me, and for him, it's already like a little bit old news. So I don't know. Maybe it's because me being his parent, I'm constantly exposing him to this stuff. My mom wasn't really a horror person, so um, I think he's been exposed to a lot more, a lot sooner than I was, and so I don't know if we're ready for Stephen King quite yet, but maybe something like Cujo that could hold his interest.
Yeah, yeah. No, I'm taking mental notes here because my daughter is 6 years old, and so at the moment, like we're reading Roald Dahl stories, so it's not quite horror, but there's something a little bit weird and disconnected and almost bizarro about it. But yeah, if he's 8 and Goosebumps is looking a little bit, he can move on. I need to read Goosebumps to my daughter immediately. It's like, this is the time. This is the takeaway that I've got already from this.
He's been a little reluctant with scary stories. to Tell in the Dark because of the illustrations, and we did watch a little bit of the movie. He tapped out at a certain point, but I think that might be our transition into more of the adult fare.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm envious because I didn't grow up with Goosebumps. I mean, I barely. Uh, I can appreciate scary stories now. But I barely even got into that when I was a kid. We just didn't have anything like that. Probably the closest thing that we had was some of those Alfred Hitchcock uh, anthologies that he would put out. Monster Museum is one, some great stories there that were more of the fantastic than horror. But there's Ray Bradbury's Homecoming is in there, so that's quite a chilling story there. So, but I never. I wish we would have had that. It bugs me that it wasn't until I was too old to get into it, and there's a whole generation that grew up with it, but I didn't get it.
It seems to be something that I have in common with writers about my age, like between mid 30s to mid 40s. We all kind of have this uniting experience of Goosebumps and Scholastic book fairs. Like, there's my son brought home a flyer, so we have a book fair. There's no Goosebumps in it. I'm not sure what the what representation there is for kind of his age horror for kids. So I guess I'll just have to keep testing his limits with my stuff.
Yeah, yeah, it's always difficult, trying to get that balance because you want to be encouraging of horror, assuming that your kid responds appropriately. If they don't push it on them, let them find what they're interested in. But then at the same time, you don't want to inadvertently kind of mess them up because it's like, oh no, we went too hard. We put martyrs on. Never put martyrs on in front of a child. There's my parenting advice. Don't put martyrs on with a kid.
That's one you really only need to see one time, I
Yeah.
think. Even as an adult. Like, it's been a while, but like I can still remember how it made me feel at the end. So yeah, maybe like for his 18th birthday, we'll have a beer and watch Martyrs.
Yeah. Yeah. That's certainly one way to bring in adulthood.
I mean,
But
21st birthday for anybody listening, not 18.
see, in the UK, 18 is fine. 21, I think 21 in Japan, but I'm British, so play by UK rules. But I guess that wouldn't work if I was picked up for any crime, by the police here, and I'm playing by UK rules. It's like, no, you can't do that here. Um, but anyway, you said that your parents weren't so into horror, so I'm wondering. I mean, when they saw that horror was your passion, you're reading the books, you're watching things like Killer Clowns and The Exorcist. Were they encouraging? Were they trying to deter you from it? I mean, what was their reaction?
I think they were, even though it was something that didn't interest them, they were open to the fact that it interested me. So, like I mentioned, reading Stephen King at the same time I was reading Goosebumps. The very first book of his I ever read was Carrie, and it was the movie version of the cover. Um, and I think I was somewhere around 9 or 10, and it was at the half price bookstore, and my mom just never said no. So she didn't say no to that one, and I guess I could thank her for that because I was I was advanced enough in my understanding of it, like to understand what was going on, and as that started to transition into my attempts at writing, I don't think I ever tried to write anything that wasn't scary. And so she would always say, I don't seek this, but I love your writing. She was very encouraging from a very early age. I have a lot of guilt for the amount of terrible stories I placed in her hands and forced her to read. And so I could get that reaction like right away. But without all those kind of formative, without Carrie, without those awful stories I wrote to begin with, then, I might not have kind of persisted and be here talking to you two.
And in terms of those early stories, do you remember the first time that you wrote a story or the first time that you were particularly enamored with your own work and what you'd done?
The very first, I think, story I can remember writing that would fall in the sci-fi horror genre was just kind of a retelling of an actual UFO encounter that my mom had as a teenager. It's a story that we heard a lot growing up, so I was pretty familiar with it. So I think I took all the beginning elements of it, of her with her cousin, kind of doing some night fishing out in Michigan, as light getting closer and brighter. Initially, they thought it was a motorcycle, and then it got so bright that it was like daytime. They said this would have been in the 70s, and they had a Doberman pincher with them that was cowering under a tree, and the light just kind of flooded the whole forest, so that, like I said, it was like daytime. So I took that kind of opening. There's a little bit after that, but that was I guess the introduction to what became my story. And then I attempted to write a novel at the age of 13 in a spiral bound notebook, and I tried to write it in such a way that I could also play the main character in the movie because I was sure it was going to be a hit. And at some point, I did convert that handwritten into a Word document or whatever passed for Word in late 1995. And she still bugs me about that. She still wants to know the ending of it. So, and she always listens to these podcasts. Mom, I've given up on that one. I hope you do too.
Oh no, that is not what she wanted to hear. Disaster. But I mean, goodness, that UFO encounter. Have you had anything like that happen to yourself?
Not UFO, I would say paranormal wise. We did have a couple of things happen to us in Guam, and I've kind of gone back and forth on, from sincere belief into the supernatural to, 20 years pass and nothing has ever happened to you, kind of start to doubt that it's even real. But we had a house that was right on the edge of the jungle, and Guam has a pretty rough history. When the Japanese occupied the island, they, they conquered it. They decimated the population, and so there was some pretty gruesome deaths, beheadings, a lot of stuff like that. So we've been told by our neighbors, who are all local. We were the only military on the street, that our house is kind of not a gateway, but it's a passageway. And so they talk about that their ancestors walk through our property into kind of look like sugarcane, off to what would have been the right side of the house. There was a big mango tree. Then there was this field. So it was a very interesting story, and we love to hear about their lore. So my wife and I were in bed one night, and I think I was just waiting to fall asleep. And all of a sudden, from about 3 or 4 feet above us, we hear about 4 seconds of a hummed note, like someone's humming in the room with us. And I think we both kind of went rigid, and we're both like, was that you? No, I thought that was you. And so it was neither one of us. No explanation for it. We didn't have kids at the time. And it was just kind of like, I don't know, just like a person in the room with you humming a song. We had dog toys squeak in adjoining rooms when the dogs were in the room with us. So, and then the most vivid one I can remember, I was sitting at the dinner table, and we had one of those trash cans where like the lid kind of flips. So like if you drop, your trash, it would. And I was just sitting there. I might have been doing homework, I forget. And it looked like someone had dropped a brick in the trash can, and there was nobody by it. It just went, you know, went like 8 or 9 times on its own. And like, I don't know, no explanation for it. It didn't feel threatening, but it was definitely, I read supernatural because, to get it to flip that many times would have been some amount of force. And I was the closest person to it, and I was probably still like 6 or 7 feet away.
And so did a majority of your experiences surround that house that you were living in Guam? Have you had other things in other locations?
No, I guess the only other thing, and this one might not be supernatural, was when I was younger, staying with my dad in Washington D.C., and I was unsupervised for the most part, which meant I was staying up as late as possible. And it wasn't, DC's can be a rough town, and I think we were kind of on the border between rough and okay. There was a sound outside. I thought it was gunshots, could have been a car backfiring, wasn't sure. And so I went to the window and I saw a man in the parking lot, probably 40 feet from me, running like he was being chased. And so I'm just following him with my eyes. And then about 8 inches from me is another face looking back at me of someone that was either peering in my window. This was an apartment, it wasn't so first floor, nothing supernatural about that. And in my mind, like I dropped to the ground and then I low crawled out of the room. It took me like 30 minutes to get out because I was just like inch by inch. In my mind, I can't see him clearly, so there's kind of like a mask in place of him. Um, but if that was unrelated to the potential crime, then that person had been watching me through the little kind of gaps in the blinds for I don't know how long. But that's probably the most scared I've ever been, like like a single moment. Probably not supernatural, but definitely terrifying.
God, that's like a real life jump scare.
Oh yeah,
Absolutely terrifying. Oh
They're
my
watching.
goodness.
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
was watching a 10-year-old boy watch David Letterman. I'm not sure what the interest was there, but
Yeah, you
Yeah.
don't want to know. That's
no,
not a question that you want
No.
yeah,
answered.
that's another writer's work. I don't do that stuff.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, you said in terms of your own beliefs pertaining to the supernatural, they obviously kind of vary, I suppose. When you're in that moment and you're in the house in Guam, you're going to be a believer to some extent. But then when a couple of decades have passed, it's funny how the passage of time, it can almost make things unreal, or like that part of our life was a lifetime ago or was a movie. But I mean, I wonder now if you were to try and distill what your beliefs are in terms of the supernatural, in terms of the afterlife, in terms of anything pertaining to the areas of religion or lack thereof, what would you say?
I'm hopeful. Like I'm always holding out hope that I'm going to have that kind of confirming experience, and maybe that was it for me. Maybe I have to kind of rely on the stuff that happened a while ago. But I do spend a lot of time looking at the sky, just willing for things to appear. And so far, no luck with it. But I don't know. UAPs are all over the place now. It seems like I'm surprised I didn't see one on the drive home. So I guess I wouldn't say I'm a skeptic. I'm agnostic. Like I believe they could be there. I just it's been a while since I had something I couldn't explain happen to me. So you start to kind of make excuses for it, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I find it difficult to be anything other than an agnostic just on the basis that there isn't a definitive answer either way. So it almost feels arrogant for me to say either way, like, yes, this is true. No, this is absolutely not true. Because normally, whatever the experience, you could have a scientific explanation, even if it's really far fetched. Um, I don't know what that is for some of the things that happened in the house in Guam, but somebody would come up with it.
So we had, I guess, enough real life, non supernatural, specifically snakes. I had so many encounters with snakes that are so much more vivid to me than those couple of weird things that happened. I had a snake fall on my head while I was taking. So we had storm shutters, because of the typhoons, and there had been a snake in the storm shutter between the sliding glass door, and we'd seen its head poking out for like 2 or 3 days, and then one day it was gone. So we just hadn't been using that door for a while. And so I was taking some trash out, like a big box, to go out and break down outside. And I bumped the storm shutter, and it was still up there, but it had moved up. So I fell out of the storm shutter onto my head, and I just threw everything and screamed. I've owned snakes before, so snakes don't scare me. But when you're not expecting to have one land on you, um, yeah. And then I was in the shed looking for something. I leaned on our grill, and there was a hose there, and so I didn't. It wasn't startling when I put my arm on something cold that felt kind of tube shaped, but then it moved, and I realized I had just put my full weight on top of another snake. There was one in the mailbox. I actually have a picture of that I can send you guys. So I guess it was balanced with enough actual horrifying things that, you know, having something hum in your room was like, oh yeah, I can tolerate that as long as it's not a snake falling on my head.
The big takeaway I'm getting here is in Guam, there are a hell of a lot of spirits and there are a lot of snakes. You've got the double S treatment right there.
Specifically, brown tree snakes. Yes, they're everywhere. They're invasive, so you're supposed to kill them if you find them, but they're everywhere.
Yeah, but you said that you'd had pet snakes prior to that. Was that also in Guam or was that back in the US?
I was in the States. I had a couple of boa constrictors, but like I said, they're used to people and used to being handled. So it's more the surprise. I can actually show something to the camera real quick if that'll. That's a snake inside my mailbox.
Oh, so
Whoa.
this is the benefit for people checking out the video. The
Yes.
benefit or the added horror, depending
Yeah,
on your perspective. Yeah, I don't want to find that in my mailbox. I do
no, I
not
just
want that.
closed it. I closed it and walked away. Came back the next day and it was gone. So
Are they poisonous, or are they just being invasive? And doesn't sound like that they are, but
so they have some sort of, I don't know if it's venom precisely, but their mouth, like their teeth are so far back, and their mouths are kind of, they don't really open wide enough to be a threat to humans. But I remember taking our dogs to the vet. There was a picture there of, um, I think it was a German Shepherd's leg that got bit, and it kind of creates that. I think it's the necrotizing fasciitis, whatever it's called, the skin
mm,
eating.
ugh.
Um, so yes, in theory they are dangerous, but not they're not all that threatening.
Mhm. Yeah. The only experience that I've ever had with the snake is some guy that we used to hang out with years ago had a pet boa, and I decided I wanted to hold it, and he said that's fine, you can. And the snake didn't like me,
Hmm.
and wrapped around my arm, and it took him quite, took my friend quite a bit of effort to get the snake to get off my arm. It wasn't painful, but he says if you panic, he's gonna squeeze the hell out of your arm, and it's going to hurt. So I had to sit there real calm, going, "Hey, just get off my arm, man. Just uncoil yourself." So yeah, it was pretty rough.
It's pretty cool to feel all the muscles kind of going
Yeah,
at once.
yeah, they're fascinating creatures. Fascinating.
Is that a kind of normal thing for a snake to decide that it does or doesn't like a person instantaneously like that?
I'm gonna.
I don't know.
I was gonna say I'm gonna kick that one over to Bob. Mine was fine.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this. He told me that that snake had never done that to anyone before, and he said that if it senses that you're scared of it, it could have an adverse effect on its own behavior. Kind of like handling a tarantula. I won't handle a tarantula because I heard their bites are really painful, and so that scares me. And tarantulas are even more sensitive to that. And so I was about to pick one up. My hand was shaking. A friend of mine had another friend had a tarantula, and he was like, "Don't even touch it. He's going to bite you." And I was like, really? He said, yeah. Uh, I said, well, is it like poisonous? He goes, you could get sick, but yeah, it's, I don't think he won't kill you. He goes, it'll hurt like hell. He goes, but you're too nervous and it's going to sense it. And that's when it attacks. And I was like, oh, well, I'll just leave it and fuck alone. Nice little spider. You stay there, you know? But yeah, but the snakes, he had never seen that behavior before. And it wasn't like being aggressive. It was just, but it wasn't very comfortable.
Hmm.
Yeah, I've handled both boa constrictors and tarantulas because when I was kind of school age, occasionally you'd have like the reptile man come in.
Mhm.
So that was kind of the exposure to them. But I didn't know about them both being so sensitive to fear, but it makes total sense. And yeah, I'm glad you didn't pick up that tarantula, Bob.
Me too.
Mhm.
Yeah, I've never seen anybody ever get bit by one or anything like that. But other than my friend, he said, yeah, when he first got him, it bit him, and he says it's not a pleasant experience. He said it was quite painful, and I just didn't even want to imagine that. I've been stung by I've been stung by bees, I've been stung by wasp, and I don't like that. That's and it's not something I'm just, hey, I can't wait for it to happen again. It's not a very pleasant experience at all.
Yeah, yeah. So you mentioned being from a military background, and I believe you served in the Air Force for around 18 years now. So I'm wondering how that began and if your parents being from that background meant that it was always something that you wanted to do, or if you had other aspirations earlier on.
I think military brats kind of grow up one or two ways. Like they can't wait to follow in their parents' footsteps, or like for me, it was, I want to do anything but be in the Air Force and follow in my parents' footsteps. So I kind of I tried to make it on my own for a little bit. After we left England, I moved back to Texas, and just kind of did all the menial labor. I was used to clean up a butcher shop, so I was cleaning up the blood afterwards. I was a donut fryer. I tested cotton overnight and did all the things. I had an apartment with a mattress, a TV tray, and like one of every utensil, one fork, like, and I realized I wasn't getting anywhere. So kind of went back home with my tail between my legs and um, decided to try out the Air Force. That you could do your 4 years and still get all the educational benefits, or 6 years and get a little bit more money. So I didn't go in thinking that it was necessarily going to be a lifelong commitment, or 20-year commitment, which is kind of the next milestone for me. That'll be retirement. Um, but kind of kept on resetting my goals. So to get in and to get the job that I got, which you'd have to score pretty well to get it. So after that, it was working on my education to get my degree, to get commissioned, and so I was successful at that. At that point, you're well over 10 years, and you're like, I might as well just stay in.
Yeah, and in terms of the writing, were you always writing throughout your life? So every period that we're talking about, were you working on your craft, or was that something that you put on hold and then returned to?
I've always considered myself a writer. I think my childhood, that was always the goal, and so that might have been part of it. With joining the military was kind of like admitting defeat in a way, that I'm not successful at this. Um, and then, so whether or not I wrote, that kind of depended on if I even had access to a word processor. When I was living alone, I didn't have a computer. So I probably didn't even have a notebook at the time. once I got in the Air Force, that first part of your career is pretty front loaded with a lot of training, and then you take on some college on your own. And so it felt like it took me a good 8 years or so before I felt settled and was able to, now I have a house, I can afford some things and have, I guess, enough stability and peace of mind that I can try in earnest. So I think I checked out some writing communities on, I don't know if this is even a thing anymore, but Blogspot. I had a page on Blogspot, and they were like, you writers would support each other and send each other work and stuff like that. Um, but I was always reluctant to expose myself to critiques. I think I was around 20, 29, 30 ish when I sent my first story to someone that wasn't like to be judged, basically. And that was to the Writer's Digest short story competition. And I sent a horror story under the genre competition, and I got an honorable mention. So in retrospect, I don't know if I deserved it. It feels, I'm not super proud of it, but that gave me some confidence to try again. And I, around that time, probably 2000, mid 2015, 16 ish, podcasts kind of came onto my radar. So I started listening to the No Sleep podcast as a fan for several seasons before I ever thought, well, I've written a ton of stories now. Let me see if, maybe one of those are good enough for the podcast. And so the first one I submitted, got on, and I kind of like, it was incremental. Every little success mixed with some rejections as well. And those were always hard because I hadn't developed thick enough skin, but the successes were they weren't too far apart that I lost hope. So I was writing in between every success and every failure, and eventually kind of got to become almost a regular on No Sleep and had enough to put together a collection. And the whole, like, everything after that is a little bit of, I'm sure there's some talent mixed in there, but there's some luck as well as far as the novellas I've written and other stuff that's been successful.
Yeah, and I think No Sleep podcast is probably my favorite fiction podcast, and I've been fortunate enough to have a couple of stories on there, and it's so rewarding as a writer. Like, forget about anything to do with the pay, but the production, the audio quality, the actors. So it must have been such an amazing moment for you when you got that first acceptance and then you heard your story, because it's an adaptation. It's the audio equivalent of having your story made into a movie.
At that point, I had been like a fan on the Facebook page and interacting with the other writers and the voice actors and all that. And so when my first one, I remember when it got accepted, I was stationed in Alabama at the time, and my wife and I were dancing in the kitchen. That's also a very vivid memory. And I was sure, because I had seen it happen with other writers, that, oh, I'm going to be doing like Q&As and people are going to be, this is going to change my life. I was sure that was going to happen. And then my story dropped, and it was on the pay side. So that cuts your audience by probably 90%. And no one said anything about it. It wasn't a bad story. And so it's kind of like a deflating feeling. And then eventually at the end of that, you just want to try harder. Like, okay, that was a good enough story to be accepted. It caused, maybe a little ripple of attention. But now I want to try harder. I want to be, the stories they always talk about, Baraska, Pancake Family, like those heavy hitters that when people say, what's your favorite story, or what's the most disturbing story, I want it to be on some, what's your most blank lists for No Sleep.
Yeah. Yeah, and you've said in previous interviews that your military experience has given you the confidence to be a writer. And I'd love to unpack that a little bit more in terms of the specifics there.
Well, the military at various points in your career will break you down so that they can build you up. Definitely the first, your introduction at basic training. It's a lot of yelling, a lot of push-ups. It's all the the stuff you would kind of, what you would expect after watching something like Platoon. Um, that wasn't my experience. I'm Air Force, not Army, so a little bit different. We still got yelled at. Things had changed a little bit, so we weren't physically being touched, but it was real close. And we used to. I remember we had to, and for some of my fellow vets that went through maybe 20 years or so ago, had to do push-ups until the wall sweated, and I didn't know that was possible, but it is. You can get enough sweaty guys in a room, and the walls will start to glisten. Um, and then as an airman, as a young airman, you're going through um, various kind of like upgrades to get to the next level. With every upgrade, you're at the bottom of that tier. So you finish basic training, and now you're an airman. But you go to technical training, and you're the newest, lowest airman. So it's kind of like a consistent, continual reset of like your self confidence gets built up, and then nope, reset. Um, I became a staff sergeant in the Air Force, so a non commissioned officer. And then when I commissioned, I was a lieutenant, so I was back at the bottom again. So it's just that kind of, you develop thick skin, I think, and part of that is by design. Like you never get really too comfortable being in any position of authority, because there's always the next job or the next echelon that's going to put you right back at the bottom.
Yeah, I see the very literal comparison to the writing journey there. And I mean, in terms of the writing specifically, I'm wondering now, what does your writing routine look like, and how does your current job fit in with that?
So right now, I take it when I can get it. Um, my buddy LC Marino and I have opened our own press, and so I've done way more reading than I have writing, and also editing over the past since about August or so. Um, but when I do write, I actually, how it marries with my job is I do it at work. On my lunch breaks, I'll plow through lunch as quick as I can, eat in 5 minutes, which also I can thank the military for teaching me how to eat a full meal in under 5 minutes. Um, and then the next 30 minutes or so, I'll knock out a couple hundred words, and it's not much, maybe 500, but it starts to add up. So if it's not possible because of kids or other obligations, I'll at least do it during my lunch breaks.
Yeah, and speaking of forming your press, I mean, I know a little bit from what you've said online about it, but I'd love to know the genesis of this, and then what you're doing with your press, what you're kind of looking for, what avenues it's serving at the moment.
So I'm a victim of the indie press horror stories. Um, I'm trying to. I think it's pretty well known that No Gods was originally picked up by Cemetery Dance, and it was also released by Cemetery Dance in January of this year. So that notification came while I was out in the field, and so that was a nice kind of gut punch. I was kind of disconnected from the world for the most part. I could kind of access Twitter a little bit on my phone, but I was out training, and then got the email that um, basically there's a handful of books we're not moving forward with, and one of them's yours. So then I moved to Darklit, which, yeah, saw the reaction there. Um, uh, wow. I could say a lot here. Just that I tried to do my homework, but when um, the person kind of on the other end is telling you exactly what you want to hear, um, then I guess I was I felt courted in a way. Like I felt special. Like it was a, what do you call it, love bombed. and all the promises that were made about what would happen with my book. So that was an unpleasant couple of months. I had basically this entire book I put together myself, from the cover art to the interior formatting. Everything was me. All Darklit had to do was slap their label on it and then fulfill their other obligations. And it was at a certain point almost impossible just to even have an email exchange. So as other authors began to jump ship in June or so, I realized that my book just wasn't going to have a fair shot because people didn't want to support the brand anymore. Like, they didn't want to buy a Darklit book, regardless of whether or not they wanted to buy my book. They just weren't going to support the brand. So I'd met LC Marino at AuthorCon and then again at StokerCon. He's also a military vet, and he is the yin to my yang, where I am stoic and I don't approach people. He is a very much will go up, shake your hand, talk to you, like do all the things, where I'll just sit behind the table and hope that someone will look at me. So he definitely is the extrovert between the two of us, but he also has a significant business background. So I have an MBA. I haven't really got to practice much because I've been stuck in the military, and our money is pretend. But he's kind of, after he got out of the military, he's built companies, built a lot of infrastructure for various platforms. Very knowledgeable person, also a really good human being. So initially the idea was, could we harvest anything from Darklit? Like, take some of what was left over and rebrand it, or even move forward with the Darklit name, but kind of announce ourselves as the new owners. And just in discussions with the next owner of Darklit, I didn't want to say owner because that whole thing was just, it wasn't good. There just wasn't a whole lot left, and the brand had been so tarnished that eventually I think we just said, why don't we open our own? And starting with kind of all the lessons that we learned, him self-publishing, he self-published several, and then myself kind of going through the ringer with a couple of indie presses. Like, we know exactly what not to do, and we have enough business savvy and business sense to be a place that people want to affiliate themselves with. So I haven't said the name yet. It's Sobelo Books. And so we've done a couple of re-releases. We have a couple announced originals. Catherine McCarthy, we're going to re-release one of Robotone's. Alan Baxter's, where we're releasing a couple of his. And then there's some other ones, Chris DeLeo, and some not announced yet that we're still hopeful for.
Yeah, and to go back to the beginning with Cemetery Dance, so and like we don't need to get into the depths of it if you'd prefer not to, but so what you're saying is, so that the copy that you showed us, that was released, that was out, that was available for people to buy, is that right?
Not through Cemetery Dance. So I was supposed to come out with Cemetery Dance. I was an October release.
Okay.
But I'd been under contract with them for about 9 months at that point. So, and if anybody wants to, like, this was a gamble, what I did this whole thing on my own, and then I just put it in publishers' hands and said, this book is done. Like, there's a handful of that still, I didn't have the rights back to them yet, but by the time this would have been published with the press, I would have had the rights back. So I got the formatting, I got the cover art, everything kind of put together, and said, this, if you want to get behind it, this thing's done. And Cemetery Dance was the first one to write back and said yes. But then, with some turnover in personnel there, and I'm sure it was a business decision. Wasn't long after me that other people kind of experienced some issues with them with their releases. Like, I think Jonathan Jans had some issues there with like pre-orders not being delivered. I saw like a handful of the next releases kind of there was some stuff I think going on behind the scenes. So maybe it was a blessing in disguise that I didn't end up there. But yeah, I was one of I think 3 authors whose books were cut. I know C.S. Humble, his books were also cut. The third author, I'm just forgetting the name there.
Yeah, yeah, goodness. I mean, to say it's been an unfortunate situation is to wildly understate it. And I mean, having recently read the collection No Gods Only Chaos, it's absolutely fantastic. So I'm really hoping that, this re-release, I mean, it's almost bizarre. Do we call it a re-release or an original release? Because none of the original releases happened much, but I do hope that a lot of attention is brought to it, because I mean, it really, within the collection, it shows such a wide range and showcases honestly all of the facets of horror.
Yeah, I mean, I hope if anyone has a takeaway, like if they don't know me, that by the time they're done reading it, that's their takeaway. Like I can write anything, and that part of this is because you're seeing the result of me submitting to various calls. So naturally, that dictates that you're going to write a different kind of story, because I was trying to land in like the Human Monsters anthology versus the Picnic in the Graveyard anthology. So a handful of those are, stories that I landed in anthologies, and I'm always trying to be different. When I land in an anthology, I want my story to be like nothing they've ever read, because there tends to be a lot of overlap, especially when it's themed. Um, that you're going to get a lot of very similar stories. So I try to do, come at it from a different perspective, or uh, just do something unexpected, so that even if the even if it's not their favorite story, it's original.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
when I
think
was I was going to say when I was reading it, I had sensed shades of Matheson and William Nolan and Charles Beaumont, and it had a lot of these stories had this kind of a Twilight Zone edge to them. But the to me, it's the characters, and you use setting as characters so well that actually kind of made those stories. I mean, they're your own. They could only have come from you. So yeah, they're tinged with the inspirations, at least what I felt. And uh I was like, man, this just reading it, and I remember seeing it on social media and things like that, and it's like, well, it's my TBR is pretty big, and I'm like, I better get on this one, and I'm like, oh, why didn't I read this when I first saw it? Oh my god, it's so good. And I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and read some stories again. So yeah, it's a great collection. It's if anyone's listening, you need to get it now.
And you can buy it from my press, Sobelo Books. I'll autograph one and kiss it and send it to you.
yeah, I mean, that's a way to ensure that it's not going to go under, or you're not gonna, be messed about by the publisher. It's like you become the publisher.
Exactly.
And I mean, in terms of originality being important to you, I'm wondering, when you see a call for a story under a certain theme, what are the initial steps in terms of when you're looking at what you write? I mean, I know, for example, that Stephen Graham Jones, one of the things that he does is he'll write a list of all the things he doesn't want to do and then see what's left.
I think where this first clicked for me was the story From the Red Dirt, which was in a Sinister Smile press release. And they're a bit smaller, so they don't at the time. I'm not sure if they do now, but they didn't pay professional rates, but it was more than the contributors' copies that I was getting. And so this was a zombie call. And understanding, and I had talked to uh, Bob as well, yeah, another Bob, just like curious, how many submissions do you get for something like this? And he said about 300. So 300 zombie stories. A lot of them are going to hit very similar beats, but I bet none of them were set in the Dust Bowl. So if I can do something from, out the gate to make myself different, because it may come down to, as they're reading, they're accepting, because there's a potential that these people are submitting multiple places. So there's only so much time they have to say yes to a story and kind of lock it in. So they're accepting stories if they have two that are, you're down to your last two. They're very similar. One set in the Dust Bowl and the other set in modern times. Well, we don't have a Dust Bowl story. So I kind of use that logic. And then I took it forward with my Picnic in the Graveyard, which was Cemetery Joe. I I wanted to do something that was outlandish but also funny. And the very next one after that I landed was Human Monsters. And my goal there was to make you kind of root for the bad guy. So whatever the call is, what can I do that the editors or whoever's leading the call probably hasn't seen yet?
Yeah, and I mean, in terms of Cemetery Joe, I mean, that is a hell of an opening story. It's very bold, it's very playful. There's a hell of a lot of comedy to it, at least for my fucked up sense of humor. So, I mean, I'm wondering, did you always know that you were going to open with this one?
I felt like it was kind of, if you can make it past this story, then you can make it through the rest of it. It has enough. I think it shows a range. Like some of it almost gets a little. I wouldn't say cosmic, but there's some little. Um, there's definitely a supernatural element that's beyond the fact that this person is reanimating dead bodies, and actually, I think leading to some real questions about the nature of life. But for that one, I think that was the first time that I wrote and I kind of removed my own shackles. So, not to say that I would say for From the Red Dirt, which was before that, that's the zombie Dust Bowl one. I didn't need to take the shackles off for that one, but this one, there are many times where I've written a story with an idea, and I get to that scene and I pull back from it. And so I'm doing a little bit of self censoring, kind of limiting before I even submit it because it's too extreme or distasteful. So, and I've told this story before, but the original title of this was Corpse Fucker Joe. I, I think I've heard you both swear, so that's okay, right?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So this was Corpse Fucker Joe, and that's what I sent in like the body of the or like the subject line of the email. And then I was like, as soon as I hit send, I was like, that was a mistake. Not only is he not going to accept it, he's not going to read it, and then I'm going to be on his banned list. So I wrote another story, which is in this collection as well. And I submitted it and said, hey, just kidding about that other one. But by then he'd already read it and accepted it and tweeted about it, which caught Sadie Hartman's eye. So she was on the lookout, or at least knew my name when the Human Monsters Anthology call came down. And I submitted the bystander for that one. So it was kind of a fortunate turn of events to submit it with that provocative title, to write a bonkers story, and for Joe from Cemetery Gates to tweet about it, which happened to land on Sadie's page, and so she knew my name when I submitted like 2 weeks later.
Is there any part of you that wishes that you had stuck with the original title, or is there any chance that if we have, I don't know, a compendium of your fiction in the future or a re-release that you may revert to Corpse Fucker Joe?
I'm good with it. I think after Family Annihilator, if people are fans of mine, then they can deal with Corpse Fucker Joe.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, wonderful. So you mentioned From the Red Dirt before, and I think what's so interesting about this one is that originality because, I mean, not only, as you said, have you set it during America's Dust Bowl era, and it is indeed a take on the zombie tale, but it's also kind of a home invasion story. So you've got so many different aspects, and I don't think anybody would have done that with a zombie tale. And, even to the point where some people might not know it's a zombie tale until quite late in the game.
Yeah, I mean, I'm confident in my writing, but I guess I can fall back on at least if I throw enough elements in there that are unique compared to what I assume is being submitted. And then now having my own press, not that we've done a themed call, but you do get kind of a sense of, I don't want to call it competition. Um, I'm not competing with them. I would have called them competition before, but you do get a sense of the quality of the writing um, that's being submitted to these small presses. So I guess for that one, I did need to check the box with the zombie, but I also wanted to do um, more of an emotional story. And the grandpa could very well have not been a zombie. And I told a very similar story. So that was almost, an afterthought. It does kind of play into the end when it gets a little gross and he shoves his guts down. You can buy it and read it and find out. But the story makes sense without him needing to be a zombie. So I figured, and I guessed right, that would be unique among the submissions for a zombie call.
Yeah, and what kind of reaction did you get from the editor?
He was thrilled. I think there was some tweak to the end. I don't remember what was requested. And at $40, that was the most I had been paid for a story, which, it's not professional rates, but I was getting $10 or a contributor's copy before. So for me, it was like I mentioned about this journey being iterative. Your first acceptance to a non-paying anthology, that's a win because you're competing against people. Then a $10 anthology, that's something. And then for this one, 40, and then professional rates. Um, and that was actually made into a no sleep episode as well. And I've gotten some feedback on that. That was really well received. And I feel like, although Cemetery Joe is when I took the self-imposed shackles off from the red dirt, is when I really trusted my own voice as a writer.
Yeah, and I think that From the Red Dirt might also appeal to fans of the movie Bone Tomahawk. I mean,
Mhm.
it obviously Bone Tomahawk was set about 40 or 50 years prior, but
Mhm.
there, there's something in it and the originality of both tales and the kind of combining of subgenres.
Yeah, I think the setting can do a lot of work for you. So that's its own. Like if you, I mean, it just raises the stakes because not only are you competing against, like you mentioned, the home invasion aspect and dealing with the resurrected grandfather, there is this ever present threat to their livelihood that could kind of strike at any moment. So, um, as far as like a writing tool, just changing, like upping the stakes. And if you can do that with the environment, if you can do that with the people that are in the room with your characters, then, that's an easy, kind of um, tool, I guess, to fall back on. Like, hey, this scene's a bit slow. Let's throw a dust storm in there. Or if it's character based, then let's have the character look a little bit too long or reach in his pocket, or just one of those things that add some intrigue because you can't necessarily maintain that momentum through the entire story, but it's enough to, um, I guess, at least keep tension in the background of the reader's mind, even if it's not active on the page.
And in terms of planning these things in, I mean, particularly, I suppose, with the longer works, and I know that later we'll talk about in the Valley of the Headless Men, but we're also prone to jump from topic to topic. So if applicable, we can go there
Sure.
now. But in terms of planning things like the dust storm or adding some drama and some tension, is that something that comes into the planning phase? Is that something that is more organic in the writing itself? How do you approach planning before the writing?
For my longer works, I am a very loose planner in that my typical process would be, and this is what I've done for my last two novellas and for the novel that I've recently completed, is that when that moment of inspiration hits, um, I try to capture it. Like um, I will sit down and write chapter one, write two or three sentences, chapter two, till I get to the end. Um, and it's very possible and it's inevitable that you're going to go back and either move some things around or eliminate things entirely as the story evolves and you start to um, you know I hate it when people say, oh, my character made a different choice. Like, no, I made the choice. I'm the writer, I did it. But I can understand how, like, when you start to add some flavor, because right now it's just a name, their names on a paper, and so you haven't really forced them to interact and you haven't had the opportunity to make those choices. So once you start making those choices, and these are little pivot points in the story, that it's almost like a choose your own adventure. I could take it this way, the way I've written, or I can take it this way that raises the stakes. So for short fiction, I might just write half a page paragraph. Like if you were going to, try to encapsulate this almost like a summary of the story. So, for a 4,000 word short story, you don't need to break it down to that granular of a detail, but just hit the high points. And then as you're writing it, look for those moments where um, if I'm a if I'm the writer and I'm losing interest, for sure my reader is losing interest. So whatever element it is, if it's the environment, if it's the tension between the characters, if it's kind of doing the unexpected or humor, like with Cemetery Joe, that um, your your readers should not feel, unless it's your intent, your readers should not feel comfortable when they're reading your story.
Yeah, and seeing as you've mentioned humor, and I guess that contrast with the purer horror or more brutality, it's interesting that with The Bystander, which is the third in the collection, I felt that it combined the pure horror of Hesitation Cuts, the second story, with the humor of Cemetery Joe, and even calling a character Gary 2 in itself is hilarious.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I think I am a very funny person on paper. Like I could, if humor sold at all, I would probably be like a humor writer. Um, but it's another kind of, um, I guess, a way to distinguish yourself from other writers. I didn't imagine, and I have a little peek behind the scenes, which I've told to other people because I asked Sadie, who ran that call, how many submissions she got. Um, and for the Human Monsters, it was over 1,000 submissions. I think they had 10 invited authors, so that left 25 for the rest of us. So that's under 2.5% acceptance rate. And so you have to imagine it's Human Monsters, going to be a lot of serial killers. So there probably aren't going to be a lot of serial killers who are concerned about their pizza getting cold or whether or not the people they're killing care about the food that they made them or would nickname their victims and get to the O's and think Oprah for someone just because they couldn't think of another name. So you take the humor out of the story and it may not be as successful. Then it's kind of, it's like I saw a very interesting review on Terrifier 3 about how it's kind of forcing us to grapple with some things that are they're in our reality right now. And it balances that, I think, really well with the fact that while you're squirming, like you're, I don't know, you're almost in on the joke with art that this isn't real, that all of this is a facade. So giving your reader a little freedom to laugh in the midst of really disgusting things happening, I think it makes you stand out as a storyteller. And then it's also, it just doesn't hit the same beats. It's like, a steady drum, and then you're going up here for the cymbal every now and then just to get a different reaction.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the fact that you have some stories that have very little humor and then others which could, broadly be defined as a dark comedy. This is what I was talking about before by saying that it's such a varied collection. I'm wondering, did you release such a varied collection early on to kind of enable people to not shoe you into a subgenre? Because we do see that happen with a number of authors. It's like, right now you're the werewolf guy, or you're the slasher
Mhm.
guy, or you're Stephen Graham Jones, which means you're both simultaneously in some
Mhm.
bizarre paradox. But is that something that you're conscious of, avoiding being typecast?
I think it's why a lot of themed anthologies struggle. And I've talked to Joe from Cemetery Gates about this. Um, and this, it's more like when we discussed it, and I've heard him discuss on other podcasts. I think yours actually, maybe, about the success of themed anthologies. Um, you're depending on big names usually as the draw, and that they might stick around for the unknowns, which I've been several times. But I've been in so many that I can't read 10 takes on whatever it is. It's like, as much as I have a bowl of guacamole, I can't eat it every day. I gotta diversify at some point. So I want the reader to have that same experience. Um, and and I'm curious as the writer, what's the through line that they're going to find that I'm not aware of? I see some connective tissue between The Bystander and Family Annihilator. I was kind of in a similar headspace when I wrote those, but like, these were from different calls. They kind of represent about 2 to 3 years worth of writing. What's uniting about these that me as the author, I don't understand?
And so, I mean, in terms of the sequencing of the collection, is that a reason why, the bystander is one that's up front, and then the family annihilator is in fact the penultimate story? Are you deliberately giving it that separation?
I felt like there definitely needed to be separation between two. I mean, they're completely different stories, but they could almost be interchangeable characters. So I was almost on the fence about even including Family Annihilator, because I thought, oh, it's another funny serial killer kind of story. But you know, I felt like I didn't have another story ready at the same quality that I would want to round out the book. So it was kind of either save it for the next one, or um, I don't know, potentially expose myself to some legitimate criticism of, oh, you did the same story twice. I don't feel like I did necessarily, but I could see how people are like, hey, that kind of reminds me of the other one.
Well, for me, there is always room for one more funny serial killer story. I don't know, though, if that is, something that people widely feel. And if people know my taste in fiction or have read my stories, then it's certainly an acquired taste anyway. But I mean, of course, we've kind of inadvertently skipped hesitation cuts, and this is a nasty little story. This is
Mhm.
about obsession. This has a frenetic nightmare quality to it. it also, to my mind, wouldn't be out of place in an Eric LaRocca
Mm.
collection. So, goodness, where did this little fucked up piece of goodness come from?
So I've heard that comparison too. So, but yes, I agree, and others have picked up on that as well. So that was for a call as well, and I initially signed on for the call without a story, and then kind of sitting with the theme for a little bit. I was like, "There's some ways this could really go wrong." Specifically, how it presents mental health. So I was my intent was not to still get nasty with it, but not to necessarily be disrespectful with someone's journey. So for our main character, it's completely out of his hands, and I hope that's something that the reader will empathize with. That this wasn't the person he was. This is what his ailment led him to be, and it was actually his wife hanging on just a little bit too long to who she was that resulted in kind of her own end. So it started with the visual. I didn't have necessarily an elderly person in mind. It was the image to me of this couple in bed, and I don't know, maybe like an invasion of the body snatchers. Just someone is certain that the person next to them is not real, but that if they just get through a layer or two, that their real person is somewhere in there. So kind of mixing in some senility and access to razors, and we just kind of took it to the extreme.
Yeah, and you said that you had some concerns initially about tackling the subject matter and dealing sensitively with mental health issues. So I'm wondering, what kind of things did you do to, I guess, mitigate or to address those concerns?
So we have some mental health issues in my family. My uncle's a paranoid schizophrenic. He's been in, he's been cared for since he's about 18. So I've always been aware of how he's been perceived in the public, especially with the medication that he has to take. He stands out wherever he goes. He's going to attract attention. So I didn't want to play on any of those tropes, any of like like just something very Hollywood, like Split, where I can just shake my head and all of a sudden I'm a different person, or because the theme was institutionalized. And um, I wanted to make sure that that mental health and an actual affliction, which is out of your control, were two distinct things, and that we didn't have a whole lot of overlap there. So it wasn't, that this person was, you know, a monster, and kind of dealing with the echoes of this horrible life that he'd led, or he was in depression, or like that his depression was misunderstood. There was nothing to misunderstand about him. He was a victim as well, who also did something awful, which I think you can do both. You can be a victim of something, and then you can still do something awful.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I mean, we've said before that people are rarely in the kind of binary or the black and white in which
Mm-hmm.
people like to easily paint them. There are often good and bad qualities about
Mm-hmm.
everyone. Um, I wonder, in terms of things with your uncle, I mean, how do you navigate that as a family to do your best for him?
Um, it's he's getting the best care that he can now. Um, I think it's with my mom being his sister, it's just coming to accept that his life will only be of a certain quality. never going to have a family, never going to have a career. And now he's in his 60s. So all that's kind of behind him. Those possibilities are well behind him now. But then beyond that, I think as you age, you start to ask the bigger questions. And what was the purpose of this life to begin with? Because, like for a lot of diseases that don't present right away, you get 18 years of a relatively normal life. Not to say it was peaceful all the time, like almost as a tease for what the rest of your life ends up being, where in order to function, you have to be so heavily medicated that you're, the you're basically in a haze with these brief moments of lucidity. So it's painful. I think it, like I said, for my mom as she's gotten older, for myself, it just kind of makes you a little self-reflective, and then ask those bigger questions of the universe, which is what I tend to do with my writing. Is what is the purpose of this life? And then for him specifically, what is the purpose of that life?
Yeah, and I mean, talking about purpose and these wider questions, that does bring us to the title of the collection, No Gods, Only Chaos, which then comes from the story Offerings to an Old God. So, I mean, was that another one that was for a themed anthology? And I mean, with that being so, what was the process for that one?
So that was for Monster Layers, which was also Dark Matter, who did Human Monsters. There was, I think they did 3 that had Monster in the title. And just to, for any writers that are listening, I paid a lot of attention to what the editor was looking for. So when it was announced, she kind of had her wish list, or what she enjoys, and I didn't do like a check the box. Oh, I included that. I included that, but I went into the story with kind of a general sense of some elements I wanted to include because I was very cognizant of the person who was going to be reading it. So for that one, I guess the way I try to stand out with that, I did try to add a little twist at the end, but also I think I prepared people for a certain kind of story, and then at that point, my goal was to make the reveal something that was completely unexpected.
Oh yeah, and you certainly achieved that. And I think if the previous story we were talking about had a La Rocca vibe, then this one, and Bob will probably anticipate this, almost had a Todd Kiesling vibe. And he's always bloody sacrificing and offering things to old gods. Hopefully just in his fiction, but never know with Todd.
No, I wouldn't trust him. I wouldn't trust him with a pen, that's for sure.
Yeah. There you go. You heard it here. And I mean, goodness, though, when you were saying before about, reflecting on, so what you said with your uncle, and then as a kind of wider commentary, looking at what is the purpose of one's life. How do you begin to answer that in terms of the purpose for your own life? And then how does that kind of affect actions that you might take going forward?
Sometimes I'm just putting the question out there and seeing what comes back to me. Because I don't think I'm alone. I just don't think that everybody wraps these questions in fiction. So um, part of it is like either conditioning or preparing myself for the worst. And that would be something like The Bystander, where I've already put myself in this headspace. So on the off chance I ever find myself in that environment, I've kind of thought through it, and I know, the worst it could be, I've already written down. And also, I'm going to check the spaghetti for glass first. Um, and then as we get a little more kind of, cosmic, a little esoteric and existential, um, that's kind of, to me, that touches like an ultimate fear. So I feel like I'm almost spoilery, but the idea of living forever but trapped. So that's part of what the monster in the end, when it reveals itself, reveals how it consumes and what it does with the things that are offered to it, and that they don't die. So you don't get the chance to come back as a butterfly. You get to exist with this thing that spends the vast majority of its life hibernating. And so you're just stuck. So I guess I've already thought of two pretty awful possibilities. Most of what I'm doing is putting um, the worst direction my life could possibly go on paper and hoping that it doesn't happen to me.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes people say prepare for the worst, hope for the best, but in terms of preparing for that worst, there is no preparation. It's just you will experience the worst, and that's it. You can't prepare for it.
Yeah, the best I can do is write stories.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, talking about writing stories, the last of our kind, you said in the story notes that there was a novella's worth of a story to tell. And I know from talking off air that you have some plans in terms of how you're going to tell it. So please tell our listeners.
So some of the feedback for No Gods has been largely positive, but a couple of the reviews I have read or that were shared directly with me said, when they get down to like each story, they would say this felt unfinished or it felt rushed. And I agree, even though it's like 5,000 words long, which is long for a short story, um, it's still, it's not enough to kind of capture a summer of four girls dealing with one of their friends being made into a vampire. So I did have a novella's length or worth of story to tell at the time I wrote that, and that wasn't enough as well. So as of now, same title, same characters, but the journey is definitely expanded upon, and the ending is completely different because we flash forward in time. I did write The Last of Our Kind as a novel, so it's at first draft stage. Um, Early beta readers are positive, um, so I'm hopeful that I won't resort to having to publish this under my own company, and that someone else will want to pay me for it.
Well, I was going to ask you about the process for this one in particular, going from short story to novella to novel. But what you just said about, you hope that you'll be able to get somebody else to publish it. Now that you have your own publishing house, I would imagine in terms of what you look like, what you look for in a publisher has risen. You've upped the ante because you don't really want to land it with a publisher where you could do the same thing. It just doesn't make any sense. So, what is it that you're looking for now in terms of when you're deciding, do I independently put this out or do I go with another press?
So for this, I guess for all, but specifically for The Last of Our Kind, I grew up reading Boy's Life, and Boy's Life is one of my treasured. I've met Robert McCammon. That's a highlight of my life, I would say. It's one of the few books I've read more than three times. I have multiple versions of it, um, and I probably read that a couple times. I don't I don't want to get the McCammon and King folks fighting in the comments, but I definitely have a preference between the two. And there's some recent stuff out like Paper Girls, which is more focused, shining the light on girls, and a diverse cast as well. Um, but I don't like, to me, I haven't seen anything that's captured that era. which is that pivot from analog to digital. Like that mid 90s feels like such a um, kind of a jumping off point. Like, so I really had the goal of making a book feel like it was rooted in the 90s, from the songs to the pop culture references to the language that they used. And so I want a publisher that's going to be as excited about investing in a story about four brown girls that riding bikes. Again, I did something different. I set it in the desert. I know there's some desert vampire stories out there, but that's not the traditional setting. Um, and yeah, that's going to be, I guess, see the larger possibility there of an audience of people who have never been represented in this genre finding their way to it. So if a publisher's on because, yeah, we like the story, or we could make some cool cover art out of this, it's a little less enticing than, I can't wait to get this in the hands of a 12-year-old girl in San Antonio or El Paso who's going to see herself in a book and she's never ever seen herself in a book before.
Yeah, makes total sense. And I mean, in terms of who you're submitting it to or how you're going about that, I mean, what is that particular part of the process looking like?
So this is the first original completed work I've been able to hand my agent. So she's on her first pass through, and we may come out the other side with recommendations. As far as the people who have read it, only one of them is not related to me by blood. So I'm trying to take all the praise from those I do share blood with a grain of salt, but they do say there's still more story to tell, and I agree. There's a lot in the middle. Like, what I love about Boy's Life and what I loved about it is when you just get lost in that middle 60%. I could care less about the spider at the end, but it's the kind of the whimsy of like Boy's Life, Old Moses, and the preacher talking about what is it? The devil is my strawberry. He's mishearing lyrics from a Beatles song or something like that. All that fun and games. If we're going by Save the Cat rules, the fun and games part, I could definitely beef that up a little bit, and I would love to. Just waiting on her response if it's necessary. Because of the fallout getting dropped from Cemetery Dance, I do have a couple of avenues that are open to me once it's ready to go to that level, like once it's polished enough.
So then, returning from it being a short story and then a novella and then a novel, did you actually write a completed novella and then you revised that to novel, or was it more in the from the short story to novella planning stage you realized actually I'm planning a novel here?
It was about 2 chapters in. I think my first
Right.
chapter ended up being close to 4,000 words, which was just 1,000 words shy of the completed short story that's in No God's Only Chaos. And I was like, if we have 16 or 17 more of these, we're well out of novella range. And then, as I guess it wasn't my initial plan to bring this into the future, but it became necessary at a point because the way the story evolved, how it ended, would have been very unsatisfying for the reader. So they needed it to come forward into the future. And that chapter alone is a relatively long chapter. That one's about 6,000 words as well, where we kind of flash forward with some characters. Um, so once those ideas kind of cemented, I understood we were well out of novella range.
I love that you're more it sounds like you're more interested in the journey of the characters than the actual resolution. And I mean, and I don't mean to make it sound like it doesn't matter how it ends or how it begins or anything like that. But I feel that if you can invest in a character's journey, then you can bring it on home when you hit the ending. you land the ending better. When I'm not invested in a character, I don't care how it ends.
Mhm.
It can end flat. But if I'm invested in a character and you still don't stick the ending, I'm still probably going to love your fucking book. I mean, it's because I've become invested in its character journey, and that's why I read.
I think that's the biggest lesson I've learned as a writer is that character comes almost before story. I know we're going to talk about In the Valley of the Headless Men, but just to let y'all know, if you didn't do your research and find this out, this is like the fourth version of this story. And there are versions of this story that exist and are published where the characters are completely different. And I find those stories unsuccessful, those versions of that story, because I didn't care what happened to those characters. So why would a reader who doesn't have my insight, why would they care about it? So that I would say, and it's only been in the past 3 or 4 years that I've really understood that. Um, what stands out, like you mentioned, um, as a Lord of the Rings fan, it's everything in the middle, like that whole journey. I don't care if Tolkien spends 2 day or 2 pages describing dew on a leaf. Like I'm still entranced and still so invested in these characters that the ending with the Shire being on fire, it's not my favorite ending, and it's kind of like the third ending of the book. But like you said, Bob, everything else leading up to that, that's why I stick around.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as you've brought it up again and we've hinted at it many times, let's just jump into In the Valley of the
Let's do it.
Headless Men. What was the origin story for this one? And then how did it come to be in its final published form?
I mean, origin story is my brother and I have two different dads, and mm, different strained relationships with both for different reasons. Um, but then I am someone who, in addition to supernatural, I'm interested in unusual. So, out of place artifacts. I don't know if that's a term that's familiar to either one of you. So this is like, oh, I found a Roman coin 50 feet down, like in the soil, in Minnesota. Like, how did that get there?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So I spent a lot of time like reading about, and I have multiple books about it, just like that. It's kind of become a bit of a more accepted in culture now. With I'm forgetting his name. I have a couple. Graham Hancock, with some of his programs on Netflix. Um, so I've always been interested in those like forbidden mysteries, hidden history, stuff like that. And so at some point, I found my way to the Nahanni Valley, which is a real place, and it has this real history behind it of on the non supernatural side, like the very much terrestrial and um, human side, that there were several instances through the 1900s of explorers, um, trappers, people hoping to find gold, going to this extremely remote, like if you haven't looked at it on a map, it is up there. It is far away from anything. Going to this extremely remote place and not coming back. Months, whatever, later, they are found with their heads missing. The torso, the body's there, but the head is gone. And understanding, yes, there are predators up there, but what predator would behead a human and leave the good meat? Like, I would assume it's something that would want the head as a prize. And so there's this the native culture or the native people who previously inhabited the region. They're called the Dene. Have stories in their history about giants, and they said they were chased away by giants. And you throw in like, oh, there's out of place vegetation. There's things that grow here that shouldn't. To legends of this is the entrance to the inner earth. To there are still rogue mammoth herds. Like all of that. It's just like I love it because it feels like so much of the world is accounted for. To have this one place where there's still the possibility of magic, of the unknown to exist, it felt like the biggest playground for a writer. That there is another book by the exact same title, but it's not a horror book. For a horror writer, it's like, why hasn't anybody done this before? So I took the environment. There's been several iterations of this story. Once I made it about myself and my brother, that's kind of what I think made it meaningful for me as the writer.
So where are the other iterations of the story? Are they available? Can people still read them?
Mm-hmm. There's a version on the pay side of No Sleep. That one came out of about a 8,000 word short story that is also in my collection called The Rat King, which is a fully illustrated collection. A lot of my No Sleep stories are in there. But in that iteration, they're college kids on a reverse spring break. So instead of going somewhere tropical, they're going somewhere, the exact opposite. So I wrote that with no research whatsoever. This place sounds really cool. I'm going to put a bunch of college kids in there and do awful stuff to them. And I realized, I think hearing it in audio, it pointed out every flaw to me. So the idea has stuck with me. I felt like, and Bob, like you were talking about sticking the landing, I felt like this is one where, as a plane, I never stuck the landing on it. There is a 60,000 word version of the story that, and Bob, you also mentioned Pit Dark, that I got a bite on Pit Dark and I sent to an agent and they never responded to me. So I guess it's home, and its rightful length is novella, and it's with this story that I've written.
Yeah, it's a very cosmic story, and it's a lot of people, or some people out there, when you hear cosmic, they immediately think space, and Earth is a planet in the middle of outer space, and so there is cosmic in the Earth. It's here if you really want to find it, or if you don't want to find it, it will find you. And so there's some writers that obviously Laird Barron comes to mind, Michael Griffin comes to mind. This is definitely something that made me also feel Scott Nicolay. It was it's very outer dark type story, and I had never heard of this place, never. And to find out it's real, I'm like, whoa, wait a second. I can actually go here. I don't want to. I've seen the Blair Witch Project. I'm not good with camping, but I can actually go here. There's a history behind it. I'm like, man, this is so incredible, so incredible, very, very cosmic. I was blown away by it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think that the greatest appeal to that is it is accessible. It's not. It's a tough journey to get there, but this stuff isn't from. I mean, this is from the last century when all of us here were born in the 1900s. This isn't in the distant past. Like, I think these beheadings stopped like in the 60s or 70s. So,
Have you visited the Nahanni National Park?
I've been to British Columbia. That's the closest I've been. And that was for a baby moon with my wife. So even that, probably within 3,000 miles of it. I mean, it's not like the tourist season, which is what I learned when I properly researched this for this book. It's a very narrow window for the tourist season. So I think I actually got in touch with a person up there who does river tours. And so she helped answer several of my questions, Dana. And originally, like I said, the first iteration, this was spring break. She's like, no one would be here in spring break. Like June is the earliest someone would come here because of how cold the snow melt. It is, it is basically in the Arctic Circle. But it does have some hot springs that do keep some areas more temperate than you would expect for a place that's that far north. And that helps to feed into some of the lore. Like you would potentially see a plant there that looks like it would be at home in Florida, like a fern that looks more tropical than it does, Arctic. So I haven't been there. Don't know actually at this point if I would go, but yeah, I think British Columbia, beautiful. I'm perfectly fine staying there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a difficult one where I can see the appeal, particularly as the author of In the Valley of the Headless Men, but I can also see exactly why you're like, I'm not chancing anything.
I could just see the headline:
Yeah.
"Rider in the Valley of the Headless Men loses head in the
Yeah.
valley."
Yeah. Yeah. He becomes headless man. Oh dear. Yeah. We don't want that to happen. Don't lose your head.
No, I just won't
But
go.
yeah, yeah. Oh, that is a good strategy. And in terms of when you were getting that help from Dana and you were asking her various questions, did she also provide like location photographs or kind of give very specifics in terms of that? Or were you kind of looking on Google Maps as well and like, well, I wonder if I walk that trail, what would happen?
I did. I did look on Google Maps, and she basically answered every question I had, um, and that was the stuff that I had been guessing at prior. So, like I mentioned in the previous iterations, that was based off of what I read about these legends, but it wasn't kind of rooted in the experience of someone who travels there or works there. So, as far as the seasons go, she helped me figure that out. Some other research I did independently about like when would the sun would come up versus because it's so far north, it's not like that full day of like 24 hours of sunlight. It's not quite that far, but she talked about, I think something I had gotten wrong is you just guess a place that far removed from people that the water's going to be crystal clear and drinkable. And, so that was a previous story element. And that was an observation that she had, was that with all the snow melt, with as much churn through the river systems, that it's actually going to be very cloudy. So it's not going to be this, very distinct blue like you would imagine, kind of an alpine setting would be. It'd be very fast moving water, very cloudy. So there were a lot of kind of gaps that she filled in, but we didn't go into kind of any of the weirdness of it. It was more like the actual environment as she's experienced it.
And so, in terms of when you reached out to her, was that via email? Did you, yeah, email? Was
Yep.
she receptive straight away?
Yeah. I mean, I think she was surprised I was writing a horror story, which is how I framed it. But I mean, of course, working there, they know it has another name to it, not ever, other than Nahani. So, but she was very enthusiastic to answer. She said that she does get contacted by not fiction writers, but like researchers regularly. So it wasn't out of the norm for her to be contacted for information, but out of the norm for her to be contacted for information pertaining to a cosmic horror survival novella.
And so, now that you've tackled this one, are there any other real life locations that you want to, tackle in one of your horror stories?
So I feel like I kind of did with The Last of Our Kind, in that there is something about West Texas that I feel, I don't say called to, but I don't know a better term for it. I was fortunate to write a season finale of the No Sleep podcast, and that was partially set in and around Marfa, Texas, which has its own legends about these strange lights. I'm sure Bob, being in Texas, probably heard of the Marfa lights. So I took a trip out there actually while my mom was visiting, and we went to the Marfa lights viewing area. We spent time in the town, And subsequently, I've been back to the Big Bend National Park area, which is a huge national park in the Chihuahua Desert. And it's, I don't know, there's something so like you can drive for 40 minutes without seeing another person. So there is something very stark, isolating, and once again, coming back to the theme of different, which is why I chose that kind of region as the setting for my vampire story, because obviously a vampire wouldn't live in a sunny place. So that's exactly where I put him.
Yeah. Yeah, I love the originality, and subverting expectations has become part of your MO. And, why not? Because if you're writing the same story that has already been written, well, is there a point?
As long as I don't start setting things in space, like every movie series that gets past like the fifth iteration and ends up going to space, I think I'll keep doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not so interested in in those stories, but that can be for the This Is Space podcast, which anyone else can start but me. Well, we are coming up to the time that we have together today, so I wanted to ask a few questions that I often do to first time interviewees. And so, to begin with, I wonder, what advice would you give to your 18-year-old self?
Join the Air Force because I'd be retired by now. Don't wait an extra 5 years. You're going to do it anyway. Just get it out of the way.
Does that mean you've got 5 years until retirement?
I've got a year and a half. So if I had joined at 18, I could have been retired by 38. I joined at 23, so I'll be retired at 43.
Okay. So then, when you retire, will you from the Air Force, will you be looking at taking on another day job? Will you be hoping that writing has done its magic and you are now a full-time writer plus retirement check? What are the plans for the future there?
I guess the hope and the dream would be the latter, that I can be successful enough at this that, and with Sobelo Books, that maybe at some point we'll start making money off of it. Um, right now we're not. We're losing a lot, but that's okay. We got to get started. So yeah, I mean, realistically, my income will be cut in half. So I'm gonna have to account for that somehow. What I haven't ever had is the freedom and the time to write. So Stargazers, my first novella, which we didn't talk about that, but I wrote that on my lunch breaks as well at work. So for an hour a day, I would chip away at that story. I've never had really, you know, unobstructed 7 or 8 hours to just sit down and write. Not to say I had the stamina for that, but if I can be as produce the work that I have really less than part time, maybe it's possible I could do it full time and be successful at it.
I think you've got a really big chance of making that a reality, and hopefully to coincide with the retirement from the current Air Force job. But I mean, there's so many things that you've got going on, some that we've mentioned on the podcast, some that we haven't.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you've got, yeah, just such a good chance of that. And keep doing what you're doing, keep working hard, which I can't imagine you would never not work hard. And yeah, I think the dream will become a reality.
I'm excited for it. Just wait.
Yeah. Well, what is the best and what is the worst writing advice that you have ever been given?
Wow. I think so. I don't know if this is the best, but a lot of the writing advice kind of flowed off me. I read several of the books. Of course, everyone's read on writing. But I was in Richard Thomas, the author, has had, I don't think still does, but he did writing through, I think it's Lit Reactor, which I don't think is a thing anymore. I think it's gone under. But he held a competition where you sent him a short story and he picked the best one. He would give access to all of the short story writing mechanics materials, which would normally be a paid for course. And he picked my story, which is actually in the Rat King, my 2 collections ago, called Comancheria. And he gave me access to all this material. And the very beginning of it is actually about beginnings. It's about the opening line. And subsequent to that, the opening paragraph, and then the opening page. But really starting with the opening line, and now being on the receiving end of a lot of material to read for Sobelo Books, I understand how important that is. I put myself in the shoes of someone in a bookstore or library picking up books. Of course, they have to be attracted to the cover. There has to be something appealing about the cover or interesting about it. That's step one. But they're going to read that first line and that first paragraph. And if that first paragraph is a dream sequence, or if it's world building because you feel as a writer, you have to shove all this, but for the rest of it to make sense, they have to be prepared for it. So you got to give them all this exposition first. It's not terribly interesting. And if I'm in competition with so many other authors who knock it out of the park with that first line and that first paragraph, then that's a losing battle. And I don't think you sacrifice any of your art to put your best work on the first page. Not to say that you're going to put bad work later, but really concentrate on that first page, because it's like shopping for a car. Like if you're walking around a lot, kicking tires or whatever you're doing, there has to be something compelling about it to get you invested, to get you to turn the page, to get you to say, I gotta finish this. I can't finish in the store. I got to take it home. Or even in the digital age, if you're reading an Amazon Kindle preview, you've got several pages. You got to hook your reader. You don't have to sacrifice artistry to still write a compelling story where you're not saving your best for the middle. Oh, and worst. Okay, that was the best. Worst. Just that I know there are opinions on things like adverbs, and I would say if it's done well or it makes sense, that there really are no rules to writing. And I think it is Stephen King in On Writing who talks about adverbs and how to make something active versus adding an ly to it. I think that in general is good practice, but sometimes the best word you have to reach for is an adverb. And to do something outside of that because you're adhering to a rule is inauthentic. So as far as rules go, I would say there are no rules, but they're definitely a reader's going to know what they like and what they don't like. And that's really why, I guess, going back to that original good advice, you really have to knock it out on the first page. And I guess be truthful to the rest of the journey that the reader's going to take with your book.
Yeah, I think these are excellent words of wisdom for the writers listening, and an excellent place really for us to finish this conversation with such, valuable advice. So thank you so much for joining us, and please let our listeners know, where can they connect with you?
I have a Twitter still active because I'm hoping Elon Musk goes to prison and that gets like returned to, I don't know, the government. I don't know who's going to take it over, but I'm just holding the space of my name. But I have mostly migrated over to Blue Sky. So you can find me there just under my name and sobelobooks.com. That's where we're announcing all of our upcoming releases. So I'm around the socials. I have a TikTok. I kind of put stuff out there every now and then. So most places I'm going to be LP Hernandez or author LP Hernandez.
All right. Do you have any final thoughts to leave our listeners with?
Be a good person, read indie horror, and support This Is Horror.